Salt and Sacrifice is a Souls-like Metroidvania and is the sequel to 2016's Salt and Sanctuary, which was impressively made by just 2 people. Salt and Sacrifice brings a familiar yet completely redrawn art style, the same tough-as-nails 2D combat and plenty of platforming, along with adding some new Monster Hunter or Terraria-like weapon and armor craft. So does this effectively build on the first game and make it a worthy sacrifice of your time, or will it leave you feeling salty? Well, that's what I'm here to answer in GameXplain's review of Salt and Sacrifice. A typical play session of Salt and Sacrifice unfolds like this. Prepare in the hub. Here you can upgrade and craft weapons, level up and buy equipment. You then go to the mirrorless gate, decide where you want to go, and then off you go to explore 5 different levels. As a 2D Souls-like Metroidvania, there are a few things you'll expect. Hard combat against a variety of enemies and bosses, loads of platforming, and best of all, shortcuts and traversal upgrades. There's quite a bit to the combat. You can dodge, block and parry, unleash light and heavy attacks, including a few combos depending on what weapon you're using. And then you can use weapon-specific skills like some of my very powerful magic abilities and engage in range combat with throwing axes, bows, throwing knives and magic. There are quite a lot of options at your disposal, so I always found myself engaged in the combat system. And you really have to be, as it only takes a few hits before you're dead. Yeah, the game has Salt in the title for a reason. The sheer number of enemies is staggering, and there are some interesting designs like these guys that have about 4 million holes in them, and by god they are disturbing. In fact, there are quite a few unsettling enemy designs that are quite memorable. In most cases, the normal enemies are simple enough to kill as long as you take your time. Even a handful of enemies are easy enough to manage if you're careful. Where the combat shines is the boss fights. The game is a good mixture of rather easy and very difficult bosses. Some I beat first try, which feels great, but in general learning the patterns for the bosses was quite engaging. While I won't show them, the final 2 bosses were exhilarating, and in the moment I forgot about much of my issues with the game. The level design is hands down the best part of this game. Each one is visually unique with winding paths everywhere. I'm trying to keep the Dark Souls comparisons to a minimum, but I can't help but compare it to the stellar levels in Dark Souls 1, with crazy shortcuts that had me amazed at how they managed to pull it off. It's no different in Salt and Sacrifice, as each level is littered with shortcuts that were extremely rewarding to find. The chance of a new shortcut propelled me forward even though I was sitting on 20,000 salt, and the payoff for finding them felt almost as good as beating a difficult boss. The majority of these shortcuts were found with the Inquisitor tools, which are the Metroidvania-like upgrades. There's a hook that helps you clear gaps, a hang glider that can be used on updrafts to reach new heights, and best of all a tool that lets you activate zip lines. Finding these zip lines was an absolute godsend, and there are plenty of platforming challenges involved in finding these shortcuts. About 90% of the time I had zero issues with using these tools, but there are a few problems with the platforming from time to time that frustrated me and my friend. At points we encountered jumps that you can only make from a pixel perfect jump. The grappling hook can only be used at very specific points, so sometimes you hook in the direction that you're facing. However, at times you can only reach the hook point from one direction, but then quickly have to turn in midair to hook onto the same point to get to where you need to go. This just never felt right. The biggest culprit was these updrafts though. Again, maybe 10% of the time your jump had to be perfect to catch it, and it caused quite a few problems. On their own, these issues really aren't too bad, but when you add all the other little frustrations in that I will go into later, the game started to fall apart. The levels are begging to be explored, and I usually had a great time doing it. But, and it's a big but, there's no map. I understand the Souls-like games rarely have maps, but the majority of them are 3D, making area recognition a lot easier. I have never played a Metroidvania without a map, and I think Salt and Sacrifice would have benefited from it immensely. While it forced me to have a mental layout of the area, I found myself running around like a headless chicken trying to find one specific door to progress, and a map would have removed the annoyance involved in this. It was fine during the play sessions as I would remember where I was going, but once I turned the game off and returned the next day, I found it difficult to remember where I had to go. For me, there was a bit of padding in this game that frustrated the crap out of me, and the lack of a map added unnecessary tedium in my eyes. The biggest change from the first game is the new Monster Hunter-like boss hunts, and this is where the game begins to fall apart for me. As you explore the levels, you'll encounter these mage bosses. There are some typical ones like a fire or ice mage, but there are some unique ones too, like a neuromancer that summon brain enemies, or a giant stone golem called a Terramancer that is the bane of my existence. Firstly, you have to find the mage, and once you deal enough damage, you have to chase them to a different part of the map, rinse and repeat about 3 or 4 times, and then you will begin the actual boss fight. There is one gigantic issue here though. There is an element of randomness in these final arenas. Firstly, the boss spawns at random sides of the arena, which had a massive effect on our chance of beating the boss, especially since I was a ranged character. On top of that, these aren't dedicated arenas, rather you fight them at a random point in the level, meaning if there are any enemies in the area they can wander into the boss arena, catch you off guard and almost kill you, and you can't imagine how frustrating this is. I could be doing really well in a fight only to die to a random enemy wandering into the area and finishing me off, and I can't forget the problems this causes with magic. I had a few spells that would lock onto the nearest enemy rather than me aiming them, but since there are enemies outside the arenas, it would lock onto them, wasting precious magic that could clinch me to victory. These mages are repeatable content and you can tell they're not as tightly designed as the named bosses. The whole point of them is to gather materials to craft better weapons and armour, and at the very least, the payoff for fighting them was worth it, if not a bit grindy. Another annoyance that reared its ugly head while fighting both mages and named bosses was the resource gathering. Magic and health flasks and ranged weapons all need items to be replenished. This means that if you die on a certain boss a lot, you'll then have to go out of your way to collect resources for your magic and health flask and your ranged weapon. You can purchase the items, but it still felt like unnecessary grinding. I noticed there were resource nodes before a lot of the boss fights, so I think the developers knew that this issue would arise. So I think it would have been better to have your flask replenished just like any other Souls game. It didn't make the game any harder, it just made it more tedious. Even though I disliked the mage boss fights, the crafting and leveling system made the frustration sting slightly less. Fighting the pyromancer would net you fire-based crafting materials so I could make a fire stave, armour and accessories, and this is where the monster hunter, or better yet, Terraria comparison comes from. Each mage drops items that allow you to craft their specific armour and weapons, and this is the main way of improving your gear as there isn't much equipment found in the levels. My friend and I both got hooked on crafting the next best weapon or a specific type of armour that would help us on a boss, but it was a double-edged sword. For every new armour set we wanted, we would have to kill a mage at least twice, leading us on another wild goose chase and ruining the pacing of the game. Souls-like games are known for their pacing, and Salt and Sanctuary had great pacing, but the grindy nature of Salt and Sacrifice ruins what would have been a very well-paced game. Add in the previously mentioned resource gathering to replenish flask, and at some points the pacing would grind to a halt. Just like FromSoft games, the story is delivered through rather cryptic dialogue that you can choose to ignore entirely if you like, which is exactly how I like to play these games, especially with how quickly convoluted it gets. While there's nowhere near the complexity of say Elden Ring, you will still need a notepad to write down a whole list of proper nouns and their meanings so you could piece together certain parts of the narrative. Now, even though I don't really engage with this sort of narrative, I love when games do this effectively. They allow the player to enjoy the story at their own leisure and never let it get in the way of the gameplay. I played the whole game co-op and then about a half of another playthrough solo, and it was a great show for the narrative. I didn't pay much attention to it, but my friend was more engaged in it, trying to piece together parts, and the difference in our playstyle never affected the other. Everything in the game is hand-drawn, giving it a unique look, but I personally really dislike the art style. The environments do look nice, especially the water, it's absolutely beautiful, but I just can't get behind the art style. Luckily the sound is amazing. Firstly, there's a dreary atmosphere that works perfectly for the game, and in combat each hit has a nice oomph to it that felt great. While I can't remember any specific tracks from the music, it drives home the feeling of fighting a boss or exploring a dreary cave. I played on PC and it was buttery smooth as expected. I was also surprised at the co-op. We had about 2 or 3 disconnections across a 20-hour playthrough, and the co-op is actually normal, unlike Dark Souls. Your friend just searches for your room and joins. No messing about with summon signs or going back to your own world if you die. I wish a certain Japanese developer would take notes. I'm glad I played through the game in co-op however. It was nice having someone that I could talk about the highs and lows of the game, and it made the frustrating boss fights and platforming that slight bit more bearable. I was a mage character and my friend played as a tanky warrior class, and our playstyles complemented each other's well. Fighting bosses became a great exercise in communication as he stayed up close while I rained my magic upon the bosses from a distance. It did bring up one issue however. Some bosses felt like they were significantly easier for one style of play. At times I would absolutely breeze through the boss, as clearly the best strategy is keeping your distance, and other times my friend's up close and personal style would make the boss a cakewalk. Certain bosses will spend time in the air, meaning you either have to jump and attack or use range abilities. However, aerial melee combat is stiff, so it felt like the boss was made very difficult for him as a result. I wouldn't have had near as much fun without my friend David though, so shout out to him for helping me out. Salt and Sacrifice is a decent game. It has great foundations with amazing level design, some memorable bosses, a responsive combat system, and an engaging upgrade system. When all these are working well, the game is actually quite fun to play. However, once the sloppiness started to creep in, I became frustrated. The lack of a map is a weird choice, as I prefer Metroidvanias to have one. Another few strange design choices like chasing major bosses around the map, and needing to farm for items to replenish your flask, slowed what was a well-paced game down to a standstill. And that's why I'm mixed on Salt and Sacrifice. There we have a review for Salt and Sacrifice. I would love to know what you think of the game, and if you plan on picking it up. Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to check out the videos on the right, and you may as well subscribe while you're at it. I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you all on the next video.